Well, we are so delighted tonight to have Dr. Ryan Danker with us. Ryan is a church historian with a passionate interest in evangelical studies. He is an active United Methodist. He was born in Oregon, Portland, Oregon, and he served in United Methodist churches in the Western North Carolina Conference before finding his way into the world of academia. He is on the faculty at Wesley Theological Seminary, and he's here tonight to speak to us at the heart of the matter about the Reformation. Ryan, would you come forward, please, and join us? Would you welcome Ryan? So, Ryan, you began your life as a Nazarene. Is that right?
I did.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about how you found your way into United Methodism.
Well, let's see. The short story. Well, you know, my mother still says that you can take the boy out of the Nazarene church, but you can't take the Nazarene out of the boy. And it's true. I still wake up from time to time with revival hymns in my head. I read too much Wesley. And although I was at a Nazarene university, I made the switch to United Methodist my senior year. It was controversial at the time.
I bet it was.
Yeah. But what the Nazarenes, Nazarenes, for those of you who don't know Nazarenes well, they're conservative Methodists, really. And so I was given a strong evangelical upbringing, and I found out that I knew the Bible better than the average person because they emphasize the scripture so much. So it came in very handy when I went to divinity school, actually.
And you went to Duke, is that right?
I did go to Duke.
And
yes.
From Duke you went to
Boston University.
Mm-hmm. So you attended two very strong United Methodist schools after that.
Definitely.
Yeah. We spoke earlier this week, and you have such an interesting take on Wesley and the connection to the prayer book. I wonder if we could just spend a half a second on Wesley first before we get to the Reformation.
Sure, I'm happy to talk about Wesley. Right. I tell people I'm a Wesley scholar who teaches Wesley studies at a seminary called Wesley. So it might be incestuous, I don't know. But Wesley was so shaped and formed by the Book of Common Prayer. It marked the beginning and ending of every day of his life. And the rhythms of the prayer book, the language of the prayer book, the theology of the prayer book. As United Methodists, we have certain prayers that we use on a regular basis, and we all know, and they seep into our lives at times that we don't expect it. I remember when I was in pastoral ministry, when people were going through difficult times, they knew the Apostles' Creed and they knew the Lord's Prayer, no matter what. But imagine if you knew 10 times that amount. And so somebody like Wesley, who was even a bit obsessive compulsive, perhaps, would have had, the majority of the prayer book would have been so imprinted in his heart.
So some of the phrases that we know from the prayer book, they're familiar to us, but we may not know where they come from, like, right. Till death do us part.
Till death do us part, or with this ring I thee wed.
Or if we've ever mourned someone with the words ashes to ashes, dust to dust.
Right.
That comes from the prayer book, as does peace in our day, or peace in our time.
Right.
So those are some phrases that we might be familiar with in our faith journey, but not familiar with where they came from.
Right. And what I like about the prayer book with Wesley is that it gave him the definition of grace. Mm. And a Methodist who doesn't talk about grace isn't a Methodist, right?
Right.
And grace is so fundamental to Wesley because it's the power of the Holy Spirit.
Prevenient grace, justifying grace, sanctifying grace. Right. We all had that drilled into us in seminary.
Oh,
so,
definitely.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so it is at the heart of the United Methodist tradition. Mm-hmm. But grace is also at the heart of the Lutheran tradition. So, and this year, we're celebrating the 500th anniversary of the Reformation.
Right.
So you are going to answer for us tonight, was the Reformation a good idea? You're going to give us the definitive word, right?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the definitive word is yes and no.
Both and.
Both and.
Yeah.
Some wonderful things came out of the Reformation movements, and some, and in certain, you could say we threw out the baby with the bathwater at some time, in certain cases.
Well, my connection to the Reformation, and this is just anecdotal. So when I was in campus ministry, there was quite an active ecumenical campus ministry group. All of us leaders in campus ministry were good friends. So on a holiday, on the day in which the Reformation is celebrated each year, my Lutheran friend grabbed me and we marched down to the Catholic Church, and we put 95 Post-it notes on the door. So perhaps you could, of course, that to represent the 95 theses that were tacked on the door at Wittenberg,
Sure.
door of the church. But perhaps you could begin your conversation by telling us a little bit about those 95 theses. What were they about?
Oh, well, yeah, the 95 Theses of Luther, essentially, they're academic arguments, or they're the outline for an academic argument. And what he was doing, he was simply following precedent. He was going to a public space. I mean, posting something on the door of the church was not, I mean, it sounds dramatic to us, but it's more like putting something on the bulletin board in Wittenberg. And if you wanted to start a debate amongst your colleagues, which he was a professor, he was a biblical studies professor, then you would put up a list of your theses. And so, and what's in, I mean, the theses, they aren't complete. You read them and you think, okay, what next? And the what next was supposed to be a disputation.
A conversation.
Conversation. That conversation never took place, by the way. They never had a conversation based on the 95 Theses.
Well, what happened?
Well, nothing really happened with the ones that were nailed, but the ones that were mailed to the Archbishop. That's what started the firestorm of the German Reformation, because he sent it to Albrecht of Mainz, and Luther had a kind of a testy relationship with this Archbishop anyway, because the Archbishop had heard him go off on indulgences. Of course, an indulgence by this point had come to be something very different than what the church had initially thought of it. There's a 500-year evolution where indulgences, at first it's simply the church acknowledging you've done some kind of act of contrition, and we're going to acknowledge that that's valid. I mean, we do that in certain ways now.
Through confession and practices of confession and forgiveness.
Or simply by saying, yes, I think that person has repented of that. I mean, that at a very basic level. But by this time, it had become something that you could purchase and something that you could actually use, not just for yourself, but for relatives and other people who were in purgatory. And so it had developed into this commercialized kind of thing. And some of the theses are interesting because it's funny that it says, Luther says, well, if the Pope is so powerful enough to grant these indulgences or merits to people in purgatory now based on what I've just bought, why doesn't he just do it for everybody anyway?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
So Luther was trying to get a conversation going. He reminds me of someone who has a deep love for the church and wants the church to be the church.
Right.
At its best.
Yeah. But the thing is, sometimes I wonder if he knew how to have a good conversation. He was a very bombastic guy. He was, all right, to understand Luther the person, he is the kind of guy you want to sit down at the pub and have a pint with. Absolutely. You wouldn't want to do that with John Wesley.
Probably not. No. Luther would be a lot more fun, I think.
Luther would be hilarious, and he would make you laugh, and he would probably say a number of four-letter words and tell dirty jokes, and that's Luther.
Yeah.
But Luther trying to deal with the hierarchy in Rome just didn't mesh.
So he was really fed up with the indulgences and the fact that the money was being used to to build the St. Peter's Basilica.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
And it's really unfortunate because so much of the beauty of the Vatican, things that everybody goes and admires now, came out of an era when the papacy was corrupted, and they were spending this kind of money on these extravagant things. And so, but Luther, I mean, there are two things here in terms of money. Luther didn't want the poor paying for things they really couldn't pay for.
But they were the ones who were funding the building of the basilica.
Oh, they were. Well, everybody was. When Tetzel came to a town, and Tetzel was a Dominican friar who was really, really good at selling indulgences. In fact, he was too good. He's the one that got Luther going. Although he was never in the same territory as Luther because he wasn't allowed in Saxony. The prince of Saxony, where Luther was, wouldn't allow Tetzel inside because he wanted the money to stay there. He knew that Tetzel was too good at selling these things. But there were enough people around there that ultimately told Luther. But what Tetzel would do, he would come to the town gate, and all the officials and all the church people and everybody would go out and meet him at the town gate, and there'd be some kind of proclamation, and they would actually process to the center of the town, probably in front of the cathedral or something, and there'd be banners, and there'd be all the clergy would be lined up. It'd be quite the spectacle. And he would give his spiel about how, and essentially, it even works in English. You know, every time the coin rings, another soul from purgatory springs.
Oh my goodness.
And so it's things like that. But I think we shouldn't underestimate the idea that Germans got tired of paying for Italians to have nice stuff.
And so Luther stepped in.
Yeah. There's still this kind of German stuff at Luther, and Germans looking at Italy and just thinking, why are we sending our money down to those Italians? Yeah. There's some of that, definitely.
Well, he started a real thunderstorm. And as you said, it wasn't the theses that were nailed, it was the ones that were mailed. So his theses were distributed everywhere.
Well, the thing that was distributed most was a sermon that was similar to the theses. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
and we make a big deal about the theses.
and it's not that big of a deal. It's an academic article. So.
It's kind of a neat idea, though. I mean, and I've told students, if you have issues with the seminary, go and pound something to the chapel doors and see what happens. Now, they're glass at Wesley, so I've told them to tape them. But, we have in our mind this idea of this monk charging up against this door and pounding things to it in an explosion. And it was a bit more dull, I'm afraid.
Yeah, we like to dramatize it, but it really was kind of anticlimactic.
Yeah.
So, but it got him in a lot of trouble, and it got him excommunicated as well.
It did in 1521.
Do you think that he was out to start a new church or to reform the church that he loved?
He was. There's no doubt in my mind. He was not out to start a new church. And the vast majority of these reformers, and I think we scholars don't speak of the Reformation anymore. They speak of reformations.
Tell me why.
Well, because each reform movement, the German, the Swiss, the French, the Spanish, the Italian, even they had the English, all these reform movements were unique in their areas, and some obviously broke off and founded something new, and some stayed within Roman Catholicism and flourished within the Catholic Church.
Mm-hmm. Now, at one time, wasn't Luther asked to recant?
Numerous times.
Mm-hmm. Can you say something about that?
Well, he was drugged before authorities, before councils. And of course, there's the famous line, "Here I stand, I can do no other." And we do think he actually said that. Sometimes they don't ask historians about your favorite historical moment, because it might not have happened. But yeah, I don't comment on all the Wesley quotes I see in churches anymore, because y'all don't want to know. But with Luther, this "Here I stand." And he spoke that to officials from the Vatican. If I remember right, it was Eck that he said that to. And it was this, he was essentially putting his foot down and saying, I really do believe that we are justified by faith alone.
All right. That's the first time we've talked about being justified by faith. Right. Besides the indulgences, that was a really important part of his stand.
Oh, it's essential.
Yeah. So can you say something about what he felt and what he believed about being justified by faith and not works?
Luther, well, first of all, he was an Augustinian monk. So Augustinians were not founded by Saint Augustine of Hippo, but they took on his theology as their drumbeat. And I know you all have memorized your church history, but essentially Saint Augustine of Hippo, 4th century, theologian, bishop, massive person in Western Christianity. When you think of original sin, think of St. Augustine.
We can thank him for that.
We can't blame him for that, but...
No, I didn't say blame.
Yeah, we can thank him for the way that we understand human corruption. But because of that, so for Augustus, I love Augustine, I love the word he uses to describe original sin. In Latin, it's curvatus. And essentially, you can think about it as we are curved in upon ourselves. With, in our sinful nature, without God, we are totally and just without help, curved in upon ourselves. We are absolute narcissists.
And helpless to do anything about it without God.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's the key to understanding Luther. Because Luther believed that wholeheartedly. We are totally corrupt. And God, in his graciousness, has made it possible for us to be justified, which is just, if you think of the word pardon, I think that's a good short term for justification. God pardons us of our sins of his own work, and all that we're required to do is to have faith. So for Augustine and for Luther and for Wesley too, salvation is gift entirely. You can't earn it.
And that's one of the good things that came out of the Reformation.
It is a good thing. But let's keep in mind, Augustine was well before the Reformation. So,
right.
I mean, the thing with Luther, he wasn't saying anything new. But I think the way he said it and the context in which he said it made it sound new.
So what about the context would have made that sound new?
Well, without getting into too many of the weeds here, essentially there were two, well, how do we go about this? Put it this way, the dominant view of medieval Catholicism, which was a wonderfully imaginative and creative worldview, was essentially that you participate with God in the process of salvation, and that essentially good works were counted in your favor in terms of your salvation. Now, sometimes I think Methodists sound like that too.
I think some of Wesley's works righteousness gets in there.
It can get there, yeah, and we have to be really careful with that.
Right.
But the idea with medieval Catholicism is that by participating in the life of the church, in the life of the Christian faith, that you are in fact gaining merit. And the idea of merit was very big in medieval period. And so given the fact that we're all sinful, we have to accumulate so many merits.
Before we're saved.
Before we're saved, right. Actually saved, actually able to go on to heaven. That's why the idea of purgatory is very large in the medieval mind. Because no one, except for the saints, had enough merits by the time they died to go right to heaven. So purgatory was a place where you simply continued the process of purgation, being purged of your sin.
So that would make indulgences really important to get people that you love out of purgatory.
Absolutely.
And into the pearly gates, into heaven.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So that makes a whole lot of sense. So, but Luther really got bound up by this argument, and he wrestled with the whole notion of grace. When did he fully realize that grace was real to him and available, that he didn't have to earn his salvation?
Yeah, I mean, he was on the verge of depression, trying to earn his salvation. Because the key word for Luther is righteousness. How can I be so righteous that God will actually accept me? Mm-hmm. And there was an experience, the Tower experience is what they call it, where he realized it's not my righteousness, it's that God grants me his righteousness. Mm-hmm. Now, the funny part is he had that while he was, let's say, indisposed.
He was in the toilet.
He was in the toilet.
Yes, he was.
Yes, he was. And of course, he writes that in his journal. I had this discovery while in the bathroom.
Well, you know what? God can speak to us anywhere,
yes.
at any time,
yes,
and that's
indeed.
our proof, right? So.
Absolutely. The fact that he would actually talk about it is, I tell my students that Luther, if you want to understand Luther, he's the frat boy monk theologian. Yeah. That's Luther.
Actually, he sounds pretty cool.
Yeah, I think he'd be all right.
Yeah.
And his wife was pretty cool, too.
Yeah. Now tell us, now, wait a minute. He was a monk.
He was a monk.
How can a monk be married?
Well, a monk can't be married, but Martin Luther can.
After he was excommunicated.
After he was excommunicated, he met a woman named Katerina, and there's stories about how he got her. She was a nun. So there's stories about how he got her out. There's one story, I don't know if it's true, but it sounds fun, that he put her in a sauerkraut barrel. Hopefully an empty one.
I hope so, yeah.
And snuck her out of the convent. But she was a character too. She actually had her own brewery.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. Luther won beer drinking contests, by the way.
Oh, he did?
Yes, he did.
Well,
yes,
that would make him very popular among the younger clergy, I would think.
Yes, he
younger
would.
monks.
Just
yes.
don't tell my Nazarene mother.
I will
That's
not.
Right.
I will not. Now, together they had 5 kids.
They did.
Right.
They did, and they had a loving home. Now, what's interesting is where they made their home, in the place where he used to be a monk.
Oh, is that right?
That's right.
Oh my goodness.
All the other monks moved out, and he turned it into his own house.
So he never had to move.
No.
Lucky him.
I guess, yeah.
So the good things that came out of the Reformation, grace, that righteousness, salvation is gift.
Mm-hmm. Right. Accessibility.
Accessibility. Say some more about that.
And this is where I'll get to the both and stuff, I think. Accessibility. One of the things that Luther did was he translated the Bible into German. And this was an amazing thing. He did this, by the way, when he was being held captive. When he said that when he was excommunicated, of course, he was a wanted man. And so Frederick the Wise actually put him in his castle. Didn't keep him there against his will, but kept him there for a year. And what did Luther do? He took the time to translate the Bible into German. Actually, he created modern German by doing that, by the way. There were so many different variations of German, and they became standardized because they all wanted to read the Bible. But see, so that's great. The Bible. Read your Bibles. Yes. Right? But what happens when you hand the Bible to people who have never studied, while at the same time denying the teaching authority of the church?
So the Bible becomes something that it's accessible, yes, but it's based only on their own experience, right, and not any of the tradition of the church.
Right. And so it's a double-edged sword there, because the Bible can be confusing.
Very confusing.
Sure.
It still confuses me.
Yeah, me too. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that, but accessibility. So the liturgy was put into English, right? Not into English. It was put, in England.
Into the vernacular.
The vernacular,
into
yes.
The vernacular, yeah.
They had a German mass. They had all these, wherever you happened to be, the service was in that language.
So people went to church and they knew what the priest was saying.
Well, they were speaking to them. I think we probably shouldn't assume they didn't know everything that was going on in the Latin Mass, because if you do hear it enough, you might get it. But right, it wasn't in their language. So it became much more accessible.
And more familiar.
Much more familiar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's good and also problematic.
Well, yeah, because what happens with the sacraments and the mystery and other things about the liturgy?
I don't know. What happens to it?
What happens to, well, first of all, this is the first time the church actually starts debating what happens in communion. Until...
In terms of, is this the real presence or not?
Right. Is this bread? Is this wine? How is it bread? How is it wine? Is it Jesus? Is it, all these technical things. Now, of course, the Catholics had embraced transubstantiation in the 13th century, so you had Thomas Aquinas talking about that. But for the first 1,100 years of the church, there was no doubt about what this was. This is Jesus communicated to you by means in which we can actually take it. And they didn't ask how.
They just accepted it.
They accepted it. After the Reformation starts all kinds of ideas, like with Heinrich Zwingli said, it's just bread and it's just wine, and it's about you remembering Jesus.
And there's a great story about Luther
Yeah.
and Zwingli, isn't there? Do you want to tell it?
Yeah, that's one of my favorites. But essentially, Luther and Zwingli are arguing about communion. And hopefully you can imagine Luther just would be animated during any argument he was having. And Zwingli, who's in the Reformed tradition, kept on saying, this is a symbol only, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so Luther finally got tired of him, and he took a piece of chalk and he scratched the word est. So Latin for is. This is my body. Scratched it into the table and stormed out of the room.
He was a passionate guy.
A very passionate guy.
Yeah, with strong beliefs.
Very strong beliefs.
Yeah.
Yes.
So what did we lose in the Reformation? What were some of the things that we lost?
Well, the unity of the church, I think, is the obvious. But there were a number of things like, look at monasticism. Monasticism had been, the monks and the nuns, the convents and all this, had been the backbone of Western Christianity since the time of the 2nd century. And we can think of monks and nuns as these people cloistered away saying prayers and things, but at the same time, they were communities that were dedicated to praying for the world.
And they were often the centers of education.
Centers of education. They were the ones who ran the hospitals. They were the ones who routinely took care of the poor. They were the ones who would house you if you were traveling. There was a whole social network that was a part of the monasteries that when they were dissolved, all of a sudden, all that fell away.
And it was slow to be picked up in other areas.
Very slow,
Yeah.
especially how do you take care of the poor?
Right.
So there were repercussions to this that actually hurt people in terms of their ability to eat. And who runs the hospital? Now, in certain places, I don't want us to imagine that the monks and nuns just disappeared, because obviously they were still around.
So where did they go?
Well, they went to various places, but there were some times in England, especially, I know about, where a monastery was simply turned. Essentially the chapter, which is the leadership of the monastery, would simply become the chapter of the cathedral. So instead of being the abbot, he's the dean and the vice dean, and essentially they would almost be sitting in the same seats, wearing slightly different attire and with the liturgy just slightly different, but doing the same thing.
Yeah.
So sometimes it was a major dramatic thing where people are sent packing, and sometimes it's almost as though it didn't happen at all.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So good and bad.
Good and bad.
Both came out of the Reformation. Are there other things that we need to highlight tonight in terms of what we gained or what we lost?
Well, I think in terms of the unity of the church, we seem to have lost this idea that unity matters, as Protestants especially.
As Protestants, I think we're more concerned with finding an expression of our faith that we feel comfortable with, a denomination, a church body that we feel comfortable with.
Right.
We don't tend to think in terms of the church universal.
Right. Yeah. I'm on the, I don't know if I told you, but I'm on the United Methodist Roman Catholic dialog.
Congratulations.
Well, thank you.
You're a good person to have on that.
It's great work. And, you know, there are 4 of us on the Methodist side. I hate the fact that we call it sides, but we do. It's not, don't picture us sitting opposite each other, because we don't. we mix up. But there are 4 on the Catholic side and 4 on the Methodist side, with 2 bishops, one from both sides. And it really breaks my heart to look at these other believers. These are brothers and sisters in Christ with whom I don't have communion. And we can't have communion. And yet I see Christ in them in amazing ways. Now, in terms of unity, though, I mean, we are taking steps toward greater unity. Both the Catholics and the Protestants, and even the Methodists. The Lutherans and the Catholics designed a document called the Joint Declaration on Justification. So justification was the big linchpin that started the whole debate.
And so there's a coming together again.
They agree on it now. Yeah, so there's coming together. And the Methodists, in the form of the World Methodist Council, actually it was Jeffrey Wainwright from Duke who led this, we've actually signed on to that document so that now we are in agreement with the Lutherans and the Catholics on justification.
So it's interesting that everything that goes around comes around again.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think we are running out of time for this conversation, and I know that folks here still have questions and would like to engage with you. So after the service, Ryan will be out in our narthex in the vestibule for a while for us to engage in more informal conversations. Would you please join me in thanking Ryan?